Welcome back to Templexity and conversation about temples. In the last edition, the first part of this discovery of temples, Surendranath Bopparaju spoke about temples like no one else can. His magnum opus, Templexity, is a compendium that kind of stretches on and on and on. Part one of the conversation that we had with Surendranath was about why he wrote the book and what he tried to do with his rich storytelling capabilities. Of course, now that we come to part two of the conversation, let's look at more aspects of the book in different context. And there'll be more episodes to come along. We won't stop at 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. I think it'll go on for a long time, because that's how this huge book that he has written is sought to be portrayed, so that you, the viewers, can understand what our rich heritage, our kshetrams are all about. Welcome to the show, Surendranath ji. Namaskar. Now, when we talked about part one, we spoke about why you wrote the book, where all you traveled, how much time you spent on it, and all that kind of stuff. Now that we're getting a bit into the nitty-gritties of it, we will look at the convergence in the start of the book itself. We spoke about the convergence between Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism as a central theme of Templexity. And that's what you used to mention in the conversations also. Could you share a particularly impactful moment in your research where you felt the resonance of these shared values and in the temple's architecture or the symbolism of the temples?
Good question. And among other things that manifested in the temple art, the most compelling and descriptive are the epics that constitute almost 60% of the imagery. So what it actually means is the great Ramayana or Mahabharata or Gita, and when it comes to Buddhism, we have Lalita Vistara or Pali Canon. All of them carry the same theme, the karmic philosophy, which I try to define that, give it a formal definition in my book. So the essential belief common to all three faiths is that the body reincarnates and is subject to the virtuous deeds of the past. That's the way I defined the karma. So essential to all the three faiths are the belief that the body reincarnates and is subject to virtuous deeds. So this manifests itself in the large part of epical scenes. So one of the chapters that I covered in detail is called Epics, Epical Characters, Epical Scenes, Morals and Principles, is one of the topics that I've covered. So the convergence happens at a epical level. The word epical has two meanings here. One is epic and one is epical in terms of size. So it perfectly fits into this because large number of artistic wealth exists, and this is what brings about the convergence. And every epical scene chosen for portrayal in the temple art had a very specific meaning to it in terms of the moral values it carries, the message that a particular scene carries. And you must also accept the fact that for long generations, for hundreds and thousands of years, the epics were the moral compass. So when you are in a dilemma, just go and refer an epic, and then to make sure that people get the right message in that context, the choice of epical scenes was simply amazing. And I must tell you that one important facet I must tell you, during the research, Buddha influenced me a lot. Actually, what I began as a journey completely changed during the course of my journey because of Buddha. In his first sermon in Sarnath, he said something very wonderful. He said, life is suffering. And then he said, every suffering has a cause. And then he said, every such cause can be identified. And he went further and said, every such identified cause can be mitigated. This is truly an amazing philosophical level. So the convergence happens at a philosophical level, and of course, at a societal level, the priorities as to what they deemed relevant or what they deemed as an important aspect of the epic that must be conveyed to the general populace. So this is what is the story of convergence all about.
So the aspect of karmic temples we will deal with it in the part 3 or part 4 of the thing, because when you do a deep dive into the entire aspects of each section of the book that you published. But your book actually, I mean, calls out something very, very noble thing, which is basically that we need to preserve our heritage sites. In India, what we often see is that people kind of play around with a heritage site. They kind of write graffiti on it, and in most of the cases, something is stolen from there. Over the centuries, this has happened, that our heritage has been stolen. Some of them are in museums abroad, some of them are in private collection. Of course, some of them have totally disappeared itself. Now, the question obviously comes is, what kind of personal experiences or encounters drove home the importance of this message? Because when you are going around on your 10-year journey in doing this kind of story, in writing this, looking at the heritage site, you traveled across the entire Southeast Asia. And what did you discover that, that made you believe that individuals and societies can actually safeguard these treasures? What is it? Because I heard this story from Dr. K.K. Muhammad when he was talking about the Bateshwar temples, about how he restored it thanks to the dacoits of the Chambal. Imagine.
Yes.
So in this case, what is it that you feel that the society needs to do, and what actually was those personal experiences and the encounters that you witnessed?
Two important aspects I would like to bring about. One is this, first of all, recognizing that these monuments are priceless. It's very important. They are really priceless. And we are beholders of such great art legacy that it calls for two urgent action items. One is to stop or prevent anyone from touching these monuments. Today I can go to UNESCO Heritage Card Belur and then I can touch all the sculptures. It should not be permitted. I think the first step is to barricade all the heritage structures. You can look at them from a distance, not a problem. If you cannot see something with a naked eye, there is always a camera. You can always capture the image and look at it through a camera's lens. One is protection from anyone touching these monuments. And number two, from an engineering perspective, many of the temples have considered the impact of nature and natural calamities in terms of rain or thunder or so on and so forth. So, lot of structures have provisioned. In technical terms, we call it a eave. Eave is some sort of a slanted roof, extended slanted roof that protects the sculpture under them from vagaries of nature. Where there is no such provision of eaves, and of course in some cases there are double eaves. So our ancestors did consider that somewhere in the due course of their lifetime they will be impacted by nature. So where there is no provision of a eave, I think the archaeological department or whatever department it comes under, they must make provision for some level of protection such as eaves, at least from protection from light and protection from rain. If this can be done, I think our temples will live longer.
In fact, that's exactly the point, because when you're speaking of the kind of engineering skill that has gone into each of the temples, and we will do a real deep discussion on that, because being an engineer yourself, you would have really seen what kind of work had gone into it, be it interlocking of things without using anything, or even trying to withstand earthquakes using a special design that has protected many of our temples. Our temple architects of those ages, we're talking of centuries and centuries ago, were masters, isn't it, at these kind of work. So, but when you actually talked about the camera, in the previous comment you made about camera, and you said we can look at these shots, and your book Templexity wonderfully shows that how this entire aspect of temples can be taken up, how it is kind of the photograph, the visual element that comes into building Templexity. Now the question is, you had 1300 images in this book, but I'm sure that there must have been a vast collection of your 10-year journey which you had taken, very high resolution pictures, I'm told. But how did you go select? It's like asking somebody to select who is the best child among 3 children or 2 children. It's very difficult for a mother or a father to do that. So how did you select the most impactful images? Let us start from the cover. And what do you think? There are many images which didn't make it to the book, and which you must have had quite a manthan thinking about whether to drop it, keep it, or kind of have it next time.
Let me share a very different perspective. After I gathered all the images from my journey, I put them together in the form of a folder per temple. And then I was sieving through and seeing actually how well, and then I classified them as good, bad, ugly. So I created folders within each temple folder. I created a good, bad, ugly, and said, okay, let me check how many are actually good and how many are bad and ugly. That's one thing that helped me actually go through all the images in detail. That's the first step, number 1. Step number 2, I had difficulty in trying to organize them because it was so huge. I found it very difficult to organize them so that I can get a comprehensive view of what exactly this temple wanted to convey. So the step number 2, what I did was I created folders based on a stone type. So first thing I did was said, okay, what are the marble temples? What are laterite temples? What are sandstone temples? What are the soapstone temples? And then what are the granite temples? Within, of course, within the sandstone there are varieties, there are green variety and white variety and so on. And granite also had a couple of shades. So what I did was to create folders stone wise, and then I tried to organize the entire database. And then it gave me a fantastic view of what are the limitations a particular stone brings about. That is a very interesting feature that I actually discovered. Okay. Then I realized that in granite only some features are possible. Then I realized the best of the stone is soapstone, where sculptors actually literally played with it. Like in terms of refinement, only 2 types of stones, soapstone and marble, give you the best form of refinement. Granite has its limitations, very hard. Laterite fades away. Sandstone and laterite both fade over time. So the sculptor had a very limited choice. Once the stone type is chosen, there is a limitation that comes about in terms of what he can do and what he cannot do. So the first attempt to organize my database happened with stone types. And then step number 3, I said, okay, this gave me one perspective of what you can do and what it can be done. And then step number 3 was to organize it from a architectural perspective. There are quite a few architectures that we have. We have Khmer architecture, we have Indonesian Javan architecture is distinct. We have Kalinga architecture from Orissa. We have Hoysala architecture. So generally speaking, there are North Indian architectures, and then South Indian Dravidian architectures, and then the third one came called Visara architecture. So Visara architecture was a beautiful blend of North Indian and South Indian. Okay. So then I organized the same database again from an architectural perspective, and then that helped me realize what are the new elements or what are the differential elements in each of the architectures is something that I was able to make out while organizing the database from an architectural perspective. So it almost took me 1 year to actually organize and classify the imagery into various databases. From there I made some inferences. For example, one of the most interesting one of the databases that I organized was century wise. So I started this journey with 350 BC and then ended with 1730. Okay, fine. 3rd century BC, how many temples were built and what is the distinct characteristic of these temples in that century? Similarly, 200, 100. Likewise, I organized the database century wise. And then this organizing gave me even more insights. This gave me a beautiful view of how actually the temples evolved. And then I realized the peak of the temple building activity happened between 12th and 13th century AD. Oh. That is when the maximum number of temples were built. And not only that, lots of innovations from an engineering perspective. For example, I talked about compaction. Compaction is given a length and breadth, how much of sculpture can you generate? So what they did, they went with a stellate plan. Stellate plan is about taking a square and then turning the square n number of times. You can do it 4 times, 8 times, 30 times. So they talk about 32 stellate plan or 64 stellate plan. So Somnathpur temple that you see in the background is one of the most compact temples I have seen. Within a 40 by 60, they generated a sculptural space of almost 1.2 kilometers. So those kind of innovations happened during this period, 12th and 13th century, I would say is the peak of temple building activity. After that, innovations happened and then temple building came out. Of course, Vijayanagara stood out as an exception, and otherwise general decline started after 13th century.
So we'll speak about the stones part of it again. I mean, that's another story, another edition that we have for stones, because literally in some places, I mean, one always wonders, how did they get the stone here to this place? Forget the carving part of it, that we will reserve it. But how did this transport this huge stone? I mean, those days, there were no machines to cut it, the granite or whatever it is. How did they transport it? We'll take it up in a separate story. But your book has certain personal insights from your experiences at various temple sites. But there must have been some profound connection to history and spirituality of a particular temple that influenced your writing and research. I'm sure there must be something.
Yes, indeed a good question. Most of the temples were somehow harmed by the invaders. Most of the temples were harmed by the invaders. So I would say the most touching moment for me is to discover one temple that was untouched by the invaders. So I'll give credit to the Khajuraho group of temples, especially 2 important temples, Kandareya Mahadeva and Lakshmana, 2 majestic temples.
Can you just repeat that again for our viewers?
Yeah, Khajuraho, among the Khajuraho group of temples, we have 2 temples that stand tall as the most majestic temples among all the 158 temples that I have really researched on. Kandareya Mahadeva and Lakshmana, these are 2 temples that stand out. They're amazing because for me a temple is amazing if only it represents substantial amount of artistic wealth. I consider the temple as good only when they represent. And within this artistic layer, I divided the entire all sculptural activities, I divided into 7 parts. The first one is, of course, the epics and epical scenes. Second one is women in sculpture. The third one is medieval life. They tried to portray all aspects of their life that they thought they were proud of. All that came into medieval life. Okay. Then came personal adornment. They were so obsessed with their dressing sense, their fashion sense, that in a temple like Khajuraho, there are at least 300 different varieties of dresses.
300
dresses. And then, even more interesting, is that the 9th century temple in Khajuraho portrayed what we call as skin tight wear. More than 100 sculptures represented this particular fashion sense, skin tight wear. Just to make sure that the viewer exactly gets the message, they portrayed in absolutely diverse ways as to the process of wearing it, the process of undressing. All aspects of dress were captured in abundant measure, just to make sure that the message goes away, that they have a large fashion sense and then they have a very decent fashion sense. So for me, Khajuraho is special because 1, it was untouched by invaders, and 2, it had nearly all the 7 thematics, art thematics that I proposed in this book. I'll repeat once again for the benefit of viewers. So it's epics, epical scenes, then comes women in sculpture, the third one is personal adornment, the fourth one is nature, fifth one is erotica, sixth one is entertainment, which is basically all forms of dance and music, and then the seventh one is the medieval life, where they try to capture all aspects of their daily life that they felt proud of.
So our fashion, you're saying those days, sorry I interrupted you, carry on.
So what it means is, when I divided this sculpture into 7 parts, I realized that I could fit every sculpture that I carried, every inch of sculpture I carried, I was able to fit into one of these 7. So the final organization, final classification of artwork came about when I realized this 7 aspects of art legacy.
They were met.
Yeah, they were met. And then I decided, now my organizing the database is complete. Now I should go about writing the narrative.
And you had what, 75,000 high resolution pictures which you shot?
Yes, actually more than that. I told you I divided the database into good, bad, ugly. So I'm only talking about the good. The bad and ugly are even more.
Still there.
Yeah, still there.
I'm sure a lot of them will make it to the good later on at a later stage. Because every temple, and as we keep conversing often off the record sometime, the visionary leaders who built these temples, and you said it peaked in 12th and 13th century for a particular reason, because a lot of these kings of those times patronized these temples. The architects, the patrons behind it, they play a significant role in your book. You talked about them in detail actually. But could you elaborate some of those qualities that set them apart? Because there's so many kings and so many queens, but there are very few we talk about in terms of associating them with the temple and saying, wow, they built it. I mean, not that they sat and carved it or something, chiseled it, but they were supposed to be the patrons behind getting these temples off the ground.
There are 4 aspects that I would like to highlight here. One is the very daring nature of these kings, the emperors and kings. Very daring nature, because to be able to conceive temples like Angkor Wat or Bayon or Belur or Halebid, I'm only scratching the surface, I'm only talking about very few temples. Their ability to conceive projects that are most likely to extend beyond their lifetime, I would say is a very daring attempt, number 1. Number 2, obviously taking up a project which did not have a precedent is a big challenge. I would say this is, so their ability to conceive, envision, plan and then execute projects that went even beyond 100 years. Halebid temple took 105 years to build. That means
must have been some 2 generations?
3
generations.
3 generations. So I would say the most important quality that stands out is their ability to envision a project that goes beyond their lifetime, number 1. Number 2, of course, from a material point of view, to be able to conceive such kind of projects. For example, you take Borobudur, it's in extreme. This is Javan temple.
Okay.
Borobudur is the biggest Buddhist site in the world over.
Indonesia.
Indonesia. The temple complex used something like 1 million stone blocks.
1
million stone blocks.
Where do they get it from?
Yes. So almost I understand that 3 mountains are broken down to facilitate this. 1 million stone blocks is huge. So to conceive a project like that, I think the courage they had is something that is exceptional, I would say, exceptional courage. And of course, you need skills. It's not just matter of identifying a stone and getting a stone, but matter of generating artistic skills that are required to execute projects like this. So their commitment to make a project like this happen essentially implies that you need to have an organized training mechanism. I'll give you one instance. There is a place called Itagi in Karnataka. Chalukyas ran a training center in 6th, 7th centuries. They were producing 10,000 sculptors per year.
They had a proper engineering college.
Yes, they had a proper mechanism. They had a very methodical mechanism, because they were very clear in the future to come, the demand for refined skills would be there. So they had graded training programs, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So grade 3 were the highest paid, and they would do everything a goldsmith would do in gold.
Wow, on a stone.
Yes, on a stone.
And we are speaking of which century here?
6th century and 7th century.
So that was the vision that these leaders had. Continued.
Their vision, first aspect is their ability to, basically the daring ability to really conceive such a kind of a project. Second, of course, is the skill sets, and then making sure that there are adequate number of resources available all the time to be able to achieve this kind of a project is the second aspect. And then the third aspect is to be able to bring all stratum of the society together. If you ask me what is the biggest reason why temples survived and evolved, it is because It brought together all the society together. In a typical hierarchical system, we had Brahmins who would perform all the rituals. The Vaisyas would actually take care of all the funding required and manage all the temple funds. The Kshatriyas would go win the war and get the necessary wealth required to build such kind of majestic temples. And then we have people who do the commoners who do the work. So temple not only brought these four sections of society together, but imagine the kind of people involved in temple building. We had architects who do the top level planning. Of course, patrons were involved in the whole thing. Then we have designers, engineers we had who actually conceptualize and convert that into an implementable plan. And then we had sculptors who do the actual work. And then people who are specialists in logistics management who deal with identifying the stone and getting the stone to the place where you want to build the temple. And then we had ritual managers, fund managers, artisans, every part of the society, every stratum, and everybody who had a skill somehow got a representation in the temple. So temples were a binding force. They brought the societies together. So that's the story.
I think that's wonderful, because when you're speaking of a temple, I mean, today when we stand and look at those majestic temples, we should actually envision the kind of work that went behind creating it. Those thousands and thousands of people who worked on it, the skills they had. I mean, if you look at some of the corridors in Rameshwaram and other parts of Tamil Nadu, those temples, those huge corridors are so architecturally correct. They are not even a fraction of a out of place.
I'll actually, this third chapter in my book is Sacred Science and Engineering. You will possibly surprised to see that I could identify almost 64 different engineering aspects.
Being an engineer yourself.
64 different engineering aspects. Dimensioning is one major thing. How they handled that issue of dimensioning. Then came weight management. Then came core building technique. Then they talked about eaves. I think we'll do one exclusive session on architecture and engineering.
Yeah, we should.
We will actually talk about all the aspects in detail.
In fact,
precision is one thing. I went to Kailasanathar temple, the Pallava temples in Kailasanathar, and then Shore temple in Mahabalipuram. I was surprised. There is a Shivalinga which is hexagonally shaped. Hexagonally shaped. So I'm an engineer, so I have this bad habit of measuring everything. So I actually took vernier calipers and measured all the 6 sides. I was confident that they will be asymmetric, and I was shocked to see that the precision was so much. 0.01 mm was the difference between the 6 sides.
That is absolutely nothing, actually.
Nothing at all.
How
did they achieve this kind of precision? Really surprises me.
I mean,
really surprises me.
Because that must have been the kind of, the temple architecture, as you talked about in your book, is a delicate blend of art and engineering. It's not just art, it is also engineering. You don't just build a temple like that. There must have been, as you said, substantial amount of planning that must have gone into it. The challenges they faced while doing all that kind of work, the stones they used, as you rightly said, different kind of stones. And when you look at those temples, including the Birdeshwara temple, which you all talk about in such awesome terms, I mean, how did they manage it? That's a big question, Surendranath, I have for you. But so as we close this conversation and we go into part 3 of this huge magnum opus of Templexity, which Surendranath's labor of love, I can say, of 10 years that he traveled across countries, right from, as he spoke about, Angkor Wat in Cambodia to other parts of Indonesia and, of course, India and Sri Lanka and other places. This is kind of going to be a kind of a journey of a lifetime for many of our viewers. And definitely, Suren, thank you very much for coming to the show, speaking to us and educating us on various aspects. We have not even scratched the surface, actually. There's so much to be done, so much conversation that we need to have to take it up and move ahead in terms. So definitely we will, as we close the conversation, I just want to tell our viewers that don't look at temples as temples by itself. You may not be an engineer to understand the intricacies of it. We just don't go to a temple like that, especially those temples which are no longer have the worship actually going on in it. But those are engineering marvels which still stand after centuries and centuries. Whereas our modern buildings, after 30, 40 years start developing cracks. That's the skill our ancestors had. That is the perseverance they had. And of course, the management skills they had. That was another wonderful conversation, the part 2 of Templexity with Surendranath Bopparaju. He made us realize that temples are not just temples. Be it in Cambodia, be it in Indonesia, be it in India, be it in Thailand, be it in Sri Lanka or any other places. Our culture went across the seas and created waves there. Those building marvels that still stand up actually inspire us and should inspire our generations to come, because they had the brilliant engineering in them. They had brilliant architecture in them. Of course, they had great designs, management skills and everything. And surely as we go along in this journey of Templexity, we will discover more and more of these. Thank you for watching. Jai Hind.
Please subscribe to Nationalist Hub English channel for more interesting videos, and don't forget to like and share this video. Nationalist Hub, it's a news revolution.